But what you talk about
Hmm.
in terms of the alternative voting mechanisms in blockchain is incredibly inspiring and hopeful to the old question of how do you scale direct democracy? How do you scale worker cooperatives, et cetera, et cetera. So in chapter 10 of your book, you discuss
Yeah.
alternative voting mechanisms being trialed in the blockchain space, describing how they allow for more expressive measurements of people's preferences. What are the primary
Hmm.
benefits of these voting mechanisms for enhancing direct democracy on the one hand, and other non hierarchical forms of governance on the other? I'm thinking here of quadratic voting, conviction voting, and liquid democracy. Without getting you to summarize the chapter, I just want to briefly introduce these if we can.
Yeah, sure. So sorry, I went on a tangent. Totally didn't answer the question. I mean, so like,
Yeah,
yeah, there are
that's
advantages and
that's quite right.
disadvantages to the online, advantages and disadvantages to online versus in-person organizing. There is no one is better than the other. Ultimately, you want to make a movement, you have to do both. There are,
Mm.
and just use each of them for the advantages that they give.
But I think it is
Yeah.
interesting that there are unique downsides. There are unique potentials for exacerbating conflict, especially with respect to mimicry or mimesis on online
Mm,
forums. But what you're about to
absolutely.
talk about, these alternative voting mechanisms, provide unique comparative advantages for handling potential conflicts, which have been as yet unavailable. So that's what I think is really
Yeah.
exciting, and I'd
Yeah.
like to hear from. And I do think there are instances in which these things you're about to talk about, such as quadratic voting, could actually lead to less conflict than in-person forms of organization, or at least solely manual forms of organization. Sorry to interrupt.
Right. No, I think for sure. Like that, I think the new space. What is maybe the most interesting thing for people on the left? If you're interested in democratically planned economies, then you should be. I'm sorry, but you should be paying attention to the blockchain stuff because the space for new forms of voting mechanisms and these types of things is has opened up so widely in the blockchain space. And a lot of people who are on the left would have a lot of very interesting things to say about this. And we can create these systems without needing to have some sort of third party to administer a vote, which people don't realize is actually a really expensive service. Large cooperatives, labor unions, like already existing, what I would call like left economic institutions use these services. They purchase these services, they pay for them in order to facilitate voting within their organization. And it's given to a third party company that is probably for profit, probably like, doesn't give a shit about your ambitions or whatever else. That versus being able to autonomously create voting systems within your group of people.
In a way that's transparent and not liable to corruption in the same way as putting a person in charge.
Sure, and it can, in a way that you can express your democratic voice in a way that was like that isn't voting for the president every 4 years or whatever. Like it much more granular detail you can give. And even,
More
sometimes there's this like
expressive.
yeah, just more expressive. Like quadratic voting as an example is like really good for whenever you have a bunch of choices of things. Everyone will have, let's say, for example, 100 votes, and you can
Mm.
spread your 100 votes across multiple options. But the way that the voting power is calculated per option that you're voting for is based on a quadratic function where the more points, voting points you give to a single choice, the less additional voting power you're getting per point. So
So
basically
if I
you're
want to
able
say
to.
I only want to vote on this one issue and I am just going to focus dead set on that. I'm not going to vote about anything else. I'm just going to focus in this one lane. It's a little bit like a role playing game, isn't it? You know, the leveling systems in like Skyrim or Oblivion.
Mhm.
If you just try and go in straight into archery or straight into alchemy, you won't be able to get so high in that skill tree. But if you distribute your votes more generally to a variety of skills, you can get a little bit of this and a little bit of that. That's the
Yeah,
basic
so
idea, right?
it in like in the Skyrim Elder Scrolls example, like it's encouraging a more balanced player, right?
Mm,
That is not just strength or something.
mm.
Whereas you can abstract, like take this abstract principle and apply it to organizing, organizing with shared economic resources. Imagine you have a plethora of different options that you could do or you could fund or you could whatever, take action for. And so a quadratic vote, essentially the embedded logic is to encourage voting for many things at once rather than solely wanting one thing out of a list of 10. And this can be, I think, very powerful in organizations trying to figure out what should they do with their resources. It means that one person who feels very, very strongly that we should all use our money to do X doesn't
Get Brexit done.
overshadow
Brexit is the only
whatever.
issue.
Yeah. Exactly. Like yeah, just uses a little bit of math to modify how voting power is expressed. And this is, to stress very strongly, not possible like outside of a blockchain, or it's very, very difficult to do outside of a blockchain in a quote unquote trustless manner, like in a manner that maybe automates the execution of like the choice of like what is, or the result, sorry. So like that's so quadratic is referring to like the quadratic function that is being applied to voting power when you distribute your votes. Conviction voting works more, mimics the way that
I just wanted to interject here. Sorry, just for people who are curious, quadratic voting is, as you mentioned in the book, used in Taiwan for e-voting on budgets, which I found quite interesting.
They have used,
just as a general rule for those listening, if you're curious to see where some of these things are being trialed or used, it's often in the East Asian or Northwest European parts of the world, although it's all over the place. You can find Brazil, India, elsewhere. So there's lots of real world examples of this being used by governments or by communities, by unions. It's not just in this entrepreneurial high-tech space, and it's not just on a small scale that these things are being trialed, which is part of what's so inspiring about it. So I'm sorry to interrupt. Please go into conviction voting.
No, yeah, that's true. So conviction voting is basically mimicking the action potential of a nerve. So the way that what a nerve fires in your brain is that it needs so much potential energy inside of it, and then it shoots off. And it uses a combination of votes and time. So like the longer you leave your vote in a single choice, the more power it accumulates over time. So it shows that you have conviction about this choice, given perhaps changing circumstances and contexts happening around you in your environment. And once the assigned threshold is met for that particular option, then it shoots off kind of whatever is executed automatically because of it, which could be in the form of we're funding this effort. So that's
so instead of just voting for A or B on a particular instance at a particular time slot, walking into an election booth, that we are constantly recording our preferences for things. And then a little bit like, as you mentioned, a GoFundMe, like once a GoFundMe reaches a certain amount of money, then the project is funded, it goes ahead. Likewise, once a proposal reaches a certain level of votes for a certain duration of time, it can go ahead. So and
it does so automatically, like an action potential. Shoot like a nerve shoots.
So it's the longer the preference is held, the stronger it becomes. What's so interesting about this for me is that this is in some sense the inverse of quadratic voting. As you mentioned, it's similar to quadratic voting in that multiple credits are allocated to all the voters, except in this case, time plays a crucial role in determining the vote. But in a sense, conviction voting is rewarding people for taking long-term, presumably principled stances in supporting a particular policy proposal. Whereas quadratic funding is trying to avoid people being too single issue minded in their approach. So in some sense, they're opposites, but you could imagine a very interesting way in which they could be combined. So you get just the right amount of quadratic voting mechanism to avoid October surprise style, as the Americans call it, last minute switches based on relatively frivolous issues, or people just not taking into account the bigger picture, just focusing on one particular wedge issue and sacrificing every other issue. I think Brexit is a great example of this, right? That in the 2017 and 2019 elections, there's so much at stake in whether Corbyn-led Labour won or not, that to focus on Brexit is in some ways quite myopic. So quadratic voting can be used to encourage a sense of more active civic participation and taking an interest in a broader range of issues rather than, for instance, those that just affect you. And conviction voting can balance that out by rewarding those instances in which a long-term commitment to a particular policy proposal is evidence of principled conviction. in both cases, it's treating people's participation as more serious and consequential. It's not just a quick. It's not a poll. Basically, that's the big difference between these blockchain styles of voting and our regular ones. Is our regular ones are a bit like a poll, whereas blue or green, Labour, Conservative. Whereas this is adding a degree of sophistication. As I'm not telling you anything you don't know. I apologize. I just wanted to flesh that out a little bit.
Yeah, of course.
And you mentioned there's an organization called One Hive DAO, which has used conviction voting to allocate the funds of its community treasury, which is interesting.
Yeah.
Did you want to describe liquid democracy?
Sure. I mean, liquid democracy is basically this idea that you're always having elections, kind of in a way, in the sense that you're always able to delegate your vote to someone else, in the same way that perhaps you could say that we delegate our votes to the parliament or whatever else by voting for our representative. Rather than it being this fixed, you vote for representative, they're in power for 4 years and then they're out. It's instead making democracy more liquid in that at any sort of moment, I mean, you could probably put some criteria or some limitations to it, but at any moment, potentially, people can undelegate their votes to someone and give it to someone else because they didn't like what that person is voting for or whatever else. And you can also even choose to keep the vote for yourself. So the idea is that there's a need for giving votes for people who have specialized knowledge in certain things that you want to maybe delegate your vote to them. Like maybe I think that you're really smart at things related to urban planning. So I give you my vote as far as urban planning things. And then you accumulate a bunch of votes because you're an urban planner and you have a lot of good ideas. But then you vote to remove all the bike lanes and I'm really pissed off. And so I undelegate my vote to you and I give it to the bike lane guy. So it allows for this more real-time accountability in a way that totally does not exist right now.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Because this idea of recallable delegates has been mainstream anarcho-syndicalist, that's left libertarian thinking for 150 years. It's always been an element of institutions like spokes councils were supposed to embody that principle, but it has also been therefore a concern of people who are critical of direct democracy in general or libertarian socialism in particular. That it's just going to be too many meetings. What am I supposed to participate in everything? I mean, people are even afraid of living in Switzerland for this reason, right? Or they think they're afraid at least. The idea of people who are already overworked and feel under-resourced getting pressured with additional civic responsibilities can be off-putting to people when they hear about an idea like democratizing the economy. What you're saying here is that you get to opt in and opt out to the amount of direct democracy and the amount of civic participation you have. In other words, you can effectively delegate others to be your representative for periods of time and not, again, on particular issues. On X issue where you don't feel like you have a certain expertise, whereas on another issue that is more relevant to you may take greater, you may be more actively involved. And so this is an extraordinary breakthrough as far as I'm concerned, and quite fascinating.
Yeah, it's super interesting. And it's, to me, if you're interested in real socialism and building an economy that is more democratic, you should be here. You should be at the fucking front lines thinking about this stuff, because it is not, and you don't need to be a developer. Don't think
and you're
you
welcome,
have to be a developer to get involved.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I am not a developer. I'm not a developer at all.
Nor am I.
No. I'm not into programming.